Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. A while back, I made a video diving into the many cuts, hidden and unused circuits that have been discovered in Gran Turismo games over the years. There were plenty of fascinating things covered there, and I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already. However, when it comes to courses that could have appeared in these games but didn't, there are actually many examples that are hidden in plain sight. When a track is included in a game, it's not just about the circuit location, but also the different variations of the track that can actually be driven. For example, take Fuji Speedway, a location that has appeared in the series ever since GT4. In these games there are two layouts, the full course and the short course that bypasses the chicane. These two layouts represent the two variations of the main track that actually exist and have been used in real life. However, throughout these games, there have been many cases where a real-world circuit has been included, but not all of its possible layouts are made drivable. Of course, not every layout will warrant inclusion, but as you'll come to see, many of them do. Today, I'm going to take you all on a tour of these missing layouts in Gran Turismo. There are some ground rules I need to explain though. Firstly, I'll only be looking at layouts that were actually used in real life at one point or another, so don't expect to see any reverse variations for example. Secondly, I won't be considering any historic or classic layouts that are no longer used unless that piece of track still exists and can at least partially be seen in-game. Thirdly, I won't be featuring any variations that were intended specifically for motorbikes. Being a car racing game, it's very understandable why those wouldn't appear. And the final rule is that I'm only considering layouts that are attached in some way to the layout we can drive on, as opposed to being an entirely separate piece of track. But don't worry, even with these limitations in place, we still have plenty of examples to cover. Gran Turismo 4 was the game that really expanded the selection of real-world circuits, so it makes sense to start here. One of the biggest new inclusions was the Nürburgring in Germany, a fearsome 13-mile stretch of tarmac through the Eifel region. But that only describes the Nordschleife. There's also a newer, much shorter Grand Prix layout. However, you can't drive on it in GT4. As you can see, its front straight and final sector has been partially modelled, but only as scenery. Now, every missing layout I talk about in this video will be slightly different, as the amount of work required for them to actually be used in the game will vary wildly. To help with understanding this, what I'll do is give each missing layout or layouts a rating for their ease of inclusion, on a scale of 1 to 5. This rating is based on how much work I think would need to be done based on the nature of the missing layout and what's already in the game. For example, a 5 would imply minimal effort would be required. All they would need to do is redo the timing, AI pathfinding, and move a few trackside barriers, that sort of thing. A 1 on the other hand would mean that a substantial amount of work would be needed to feature it, akin to if they were modelling a new circuit from scratch. And a 1 is exactly what I'll be giving Nürburgring GP. When it comes to what can be seen in GT4, it's really only a tiny amount of the track, and even that is noticeably very low detail. The good news is that with GT5 they would make the effort to model it in its entirety, and it's appeared in every GT game since then. But don't get too used to hearing that. Another new track in GT4 was Circuit de la Sarthe, better known as Le Mans. Whilst the full 24-hour circuit appears, both with and without chicanes on the back straights, what you won't find in any GT game is the shorter Bugatti circuit. This layout was created back in 1965 and is predominantly linked with bike racing, but cars have used it as well. In 1967, it even hosted a one-off round of the Formula 1 World Championship. In-game, you can clearly see where it breaks away from the main layout after the Dunlop Bridge, before rejoining it again at the final chicane. It's also worth mentioning the often forgotten Maison Blanche circuit. This layout uses a portion of the main track between the Porsche curves and the final chicanes. In real life, it's never hosted any racing and is mainly used for driving experiences. It too has never been playable in any GT game. As for these layouts rating, I'll give them a combined 2 out of 5. Whilst it's clear that quite a lot of work would need to be done, and many new assets created for them, the fact that the Bugatti circuit uses the front straight and pit lane from the main track does slightly boost its rating. Moving on to Tsukuba circuits, there is just a single layout in GT4 and each of the games after it. In real life, there's the separate 1000 course and also an oval circuit, both of which can even be seen in the games as trackside scenery. But did you know that the main circuit originally had a shorter layout? This version cuts off the hairpin, rejoining the track just prior to the final corner. In 1990, a chicane was built here for motorbikes, and since then, this layout has barely been used. However, the tarmac is still there, so in theory it could be resurrected very easily. And when it comes to Gran Turismo, that logic still holds up. To be honest, I don't really know why you'd want to make Tsukuba even shorter, but it's an easy 5 out of 5. Infineon Raceway, now known as Sonoma Raceway, made its only mainline appearance in GT4. There are 2 layouts available, the sports car course and the simpler stock car course, but in real life there are actually a few more. The variations include ones with a different profile at turn 7, a much shorter final hairpin, and even a chicane at turn 9. In fact, part of the sports car course makes use of Infineon's drag strip, so you could even include that if you really wanted to. Again, it seems like everything they would need to include these layouts is already here, but I'm giving it a 4 out of 5 purely down to just how many possible variations there are. Alright, heading over to Gran Turismo 5, here we can find one of the very rare instances of a track variation actually being removed. Suzuka was another new inclusion in GT4, and along with the full circuit, it featured 2 shorter layouts, the East Course and the West Course. The East Course would go on to appear in GT5 and every other game since, but the West Course was binned off after just 1 appearance. It's a shame really, because the West Course is way more interesting than the East Course in my opinion, featuring corners like Spoon, 130R and the Degners. The only downside is that as the East Course uses the main pit and paddock facilities, this made it far more popular for racing. The West Course does have a pit lane of its own, but it's much smaller. In fact, in GT4, the game doesn't even recognize it as a pit lane. In real life, it was mostly used for testing. There's some pretty famous footage of Ayrton Senna driving around the West Course in a Honda NSX. In more recent times though, it doesn't seem to be used as often. If Polyphony decided that they wanted to bring it back, it really wouldn't take much work at all. 5 out of 5. Monza was an entirely new circuit in GT5, and it came with 2 variations, the full circuit and the full circuit without the first chicane. These 2 layouts were carried through into the latter games, but there is another often forgotten layout that's never appeared in this series. The junior course is a shorter variation which bypasses most of the circuits by making a hard right not far beyond the pit exit, leading onto a short section which rejoins the main course just after the Variante Ascari. In real life, this layout was constructed in 1959 for use by junior single-seater race cars, hence the name, but in modern times it's all but abandoned. And speaking of abandoned, that leads us to the Monza Oval. Last used for racing in the late 60s, the highly banked oval still stands today as a reminder of the circuit's past, although part of it is actually still used in the Monza Rally. In each of the games Monza appears in, parts of the oval are very clearly visible, as well as the road that makes up the junior course. As such, I'll give it a 3 out of 5. It's hard to tell just how much of the oval has already been modelled, but it's likely that there's a decent amount of it missing beyond what we can actually see in-game. Next up is Daytona, which is represented in-game with 2 layouts, the Oval Superspeedway and the Road Course. But yet again, there are some more layouts we need to mention here. The first is the Infield Road Course, which was constructed in 2002. As the name implies, this layout utilised the infield section of the road course, but with some extra corners included. It was mainly used by the Skip Barber Racing School up until 2010. Then we come to the Motorcycle Road Course. Now, I know I said that I wasn't going to talk about track variations designed specifically for motorcycles, but this one is a bit different. In 2005, it was decided to create a new layout for motorcycles that avoided the banking of speedway turns 1 and 2. What resulted was quite a unique layout that ended up being a fair bit more technical than the normal road course. As such, it could almost be considered an intermediate layout, as it was also 0.6 of a mile shorter than the normal road course. Ultimately, this layout was only used until 2009, when the bikers reverted back to the old layout but with a slightly different turn 3. However, the roads for the intermediate layout still exist, and can even be seen in Gran Turismo 7. But wait, there's one more variation to cover. In 2020, Daytona was called on to host a NASCAR road course event. To prevent the heavy stock cars turning their brakes into mush at turn 1, it was decided to add a second chicane just before the tri-oval. This new NASCAR road course did not appear in GT7 in 2022, although, somewhat ironically, the teaser that was created to announce the track's return did use its outline. All in all, I'll give these extra layouts a 4 out of 5. The old infield and motorcycle road courses in particular would have taken a bit of work to implement, but honestly not that much. As I mentioned earlier, GT5 brought the Nürburgring GP circuit to the series, including the shorter sprint layout and the combined 24-hour track. But there was still another missed variation. The Mullenbachschleifer is a layout that utilises a small loop around the south end of the GP course. There isn't much more to say than that. It doesn't have a pit or paddock facilities, and the section that links the two parts of the GP course together is quite narrow, so it isn't great for racing. That said, in real life it has been used for drifting, and it's also been turned into a rallycross circuit by way of a gravel section around the hairpin. But we're still not quite done with the Nürburgring, because when running the 24-hour course, you'll notice that it uses a different variation of the Mercedes Arena and Final Chicane. Neither of these alternate routes are available in conjunction with just the GP or sprint courses, but they very easily could be. And one final thing, when the Nürburgring reappeared in GT Sport in 2017, the sprint circuit was inexplicably missing. It did eventually return almost 6 years later in GT7's update 1.31, but the link road was always there, so why it took them so long, I have no clue. This, along with the layouts that are still absent, gets a 5 out of 5. And so, on to Gran Turismo 6. One of the most interesting new circuits in this game is the Ascari Race Resort in Spain, a private circuit that took inspiration from many of the greatest racetracks all over the world. In this game, there is only one layout available, the full circuit, but in reality, it can be split into 5 smaller variations as well. However, the lack of barriers in-game means that you're free to drive wherever, so it is still possible to experience these shorter variations if you really want to. Again, it's a 5 out of 5, no question. Next up is one of the circuits that inspired Ascari Race Resort, Silverstone. In GT6 we have 4 layouts, the full Grand Prix circuits, International circuits, National circuit, and Stowe circuits. But there is another important layout that would have been possible. In 2010, Silverstone underwent a major change as the arena complex was established, which led onto the pre-existing Wellington Straight. However, the former layout, which diverged at Abbey, was still left, albeit no longer used for racing. With that said, it still would have been possible for them to include this in GT6 as something of a historic layout. As we can see, part of it has been modelled as trackside scenery, although it's clear that a fair amount of work would have still needed to be done to get it up to the standards of appearing in the game for real. 3 out of 5 is my rating for this track. Now, over to Willow Springs. Alongside the main Big Willow layouts, GT6 also included the smaller streets of Willow Springs. This circuit has appeared in every game since, but with only one variation. However, you won't be surprised to hear that the track can actually be cut up into several smaller layouts. Much like Ascari, there are no barriers to stop you from exploring here, so feel free to just drive around and check them out. This track is a rare example of one that's often driven in both directions, and this at least is reflected in Gran Turismo. Another easy 5 out of 5. The Red Bull Ring made its debut in the series in an update for GT6, bringing 2 layouts, the full circuit and the short circuit. But in reality, there are actually 2 short circuits. The one seen in-game is the Southern National Circuit, and the other is the Northern Club Circuit. Both variations were created back in 1996 when the track was redesigned, but the North Circuit soon fell out of favour. Again, it's a similar situation to Suzuka, where one shorter layout is a lot more popular because it uses the main pit and paddock facilities. To be honest, I couldn't really find any information about the North Circuit, such as why it was created or what it was ever used for. But in current day, the link road still exists, and this is also true in Gran Turismo. 5 out of 5. GT6 marked the only appearance of the Goodwood Hill climb in the series, and although it wouldn't return in GT Sport, we would get the nearby Goodwood Motor Circuit instead. In GT Sport and subsequently GT7, there is just a single layout present, the full course. This track features a narrow chicane to close out the lap, but it wasn't always there. In 1951, this chicane was created in a bid to reduce speeds, and it represents the only change to the layout in this track's near 8-decade-long history. But as the tarmac for the original layout still remains, they could very easily include a non-chicane version, much in the same vein as Monza. 5 out of 5. Another circuit that debuted in an update for GT Sport was Circuit de Barcelona Catalunya. Originally, there was just a single layout present, the Grand Prix circuit. However, this is one of the rare cases of Polyphony adding more track variants after the fact. With the circuit carried into GT7 in 2022, an update in August that year added 3 new layouts. There's the GP circuit without the final chicane, the shorter national circuit, and even the rallycross layouts as seen in the World Rallycross Championship. But even with these, they still could have done more. Consider this. They added the GP circuit no chicane and the national circuit, so why not the national circuit without the chicane as well? Seems like a pretty obvious missed opportunity in my opinion. But another not so obvious choice would have been the club circuits. This layout makes use of mainly the first sector, measuring just over a mile and with no pit lane or paddock of its own. This latter fact means that it's not actually used for racing in real life, mostly just driver training. Once again, everything they would need to make this layout in-game is already here, so it's another 5 out of 5. And now we finally reach the tracks that can only be found in GT7. Watkins Glen was a new addition in the game's version 1.17 updates, and it features two versions, the long course and the short course. But in fact, they very easily could have doubled the number of layouts here. In 1992, a chicane was constructed on the back straight known as the inner loop. This inner loop is present on both variations in the game, but as you can see, they could very easily include versions without it, restoring the track to its pre-1992 layout. You can probably guess what I'm gonna say next. 5 out of 5. And just like the Glen, the final track on my list is another US road circuit, Road Atlanta. This circuit appeared in update 1.26 with just one layout, but in reality there's a couple more. Firstly, the short course, which deviates at turn 5 through a sweeping right-hander that rejoins the main circuit halfway down the back straight. Then there's also the club course, which is effectively made up of the section that was cut out in the short course. Again, no prizes for guessing which of these layouts is used more often in real life. As we can see, the link roads for both the short course and club course are very clearly there, albeit in slightly lower detail than the main circuits. Even so, I still think the amount of work to get them in the game would be minimal, so we'll round things off with yet another 5 out of 5. I think by now I've been able to prove my point. This is far from just a one-off anomaly. Although I've highlighted what I believe to be the most notable examples, there are almost certainly others that I haven't mentioned in this video. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that the fact that all of these layouts aren't in Gran Turismo is a complete outrage or anything. To be honest, some of them are kind of pointless. But when it comes to many of the ones that I rated 5 for their ease of inclusion, and maybe even some of the 4s, I think it's less a case of why should they be in the game, and more why shouldn't they be. It's like they've done all the hard work of modelling what they need to, and then just left the extra potential on the table. And if there's one thing that I'll always criticise these games for, it's wasted potential. If you've played a variety of different racing games, there will be something that you've likely noticed. That is, that many of the track variations I talked about have appeared in other titles. Forza Motorsports, Project Cars, Grid, and plenty more racing games and sims have made use of these layouts, showing that it isn't exactly unreasonable to expect the same in GT. Of course, this whole discussion centers around real circuits with layouts that we can clearly point to for existing in real life. However, I would also be remiss if I didn't also mention the handful of cases that this has happened with fictional circuits. Many of the fictional original circuits in this series have alternate variations. A great example is Grand Valley Speedway, which has its shorter East variant. But if we check out Gran Turismo 3, we can see that Grand Valley East was not carried over, despite the main circuit still appearing. And this is just one example. There's also Clubman Stage Route 5, a shorter version of Special Stage Route 5 which doesn't appear. Seattle Circuit debuted in GT2 and featured its own shorter track, but with the transition to GT3, this didn't make the cut either. And the same is true for the other street track first seen in GT2, Rome Circuit. That's 4 shorter variations that were in GT2, but didn't return in GT3. Although it's never been officially confirmed, it's generally understood that this was a deliberate decision. With GT3 representing such a graphical leap over the PS1 games, everything took a lot longer to make. When you then consider that the game had already missed its initial 2000 deadline, the theory that these layouts were omitted to save time and resources does seem to stack up. Granted, they wouldn't have saved much, but I'm sure they would have taken advantage of any corners they could cut, figuratively and literally. In GT4, Grand Valley East and Clubman Stage Route 5 would return, but Rome Circuit was missing entirely. However, Seattle was the real outlier, as whilst it did return in GT4, it was ported over pretty much unchanged from GT3, meaning no short circuit once again. Thankfully, in recent times, the trend has been to add circuit variations rather than take them away. Since GT Sports, we've seen the likes of Kyoto Driving Park, Blue Moon Bay, Lake Maggiore, and Alsace received more layouts after their initial inclusion, and I honestly hope to see more of this in the future. Now, back in my Secret Tracks video, I covered a couple of instances of original tracks with unique layouts that we never got to drive, due to them being cut or just left unused. For instance, the alternate layout of Special Stage Route X, the fabled Longer London, and a version of GT Arena with an elevated crossover section that's only known about thanks to a very strange Easter egg in GT Sport and GT7. All of these would also fit the bill for this video, but as I've already covered each of them in depth, to round things off, I'll give you guys something else. When it comes to looking at possible alternate layouts for original GT circuits, in some ways this can be like opening a can of worms. Take Circuit de Sainte-Croix, a location that appears in GT Sport and GT7. There are 3 variations of this track in-game, each with a reverse version as well. However, given the way this track has been designed, with there being various different routes for the first half of the lap which all conjoin at the bridge, and then another set of routes for the second part of the lap which merge just before the finish, you could mix and match these various routes to create far more layout than what we can actually drive in-game. This theory can also be applied to other original tracks, even Grand Valley Speedway for example, but all we're really doing here is just taking sections of the layouts we can drive on and matching them with sections from others. None of these theoretical layouts would have any unique corners of their own. However, this is where Gran Turismo 6's Matterhorn location comes in. This track has 4 drivable layouts: Dristelin, Riffelsee, Rottenboden, and the short track. With the exception of the latter, each of these are made up of sections unique to them, but also parts that they share with the other layouts. If you look at this map courtesy of the Gran Turismo wiki, you can see how they all fit together relative to one another. It's a pretty neat bit of design, but there are also a few unused link roads that connect these layouts in a more cohesive way. If we mark these on our map in red, you can see how this opens up the possibility for many more circuits. But here's where it gets really fascinating. There are unique, unused pieces of track all over Matterhorn. On Dristelin, if you look to your left just after turn 2, you can see a piece of road that branches off. Further around the track, we can see where this road rejoins the main layout at the final complex. On Riffelsee, just past the pit exit, there's a blocked off road that heads deeper into the hills. Later in the lap, you'll be able to find where this road leads, as it appears to rejoin the main track on the steep uphill section, or the downhill section if you're on the Rottenboden layouts. And speaking of Rottenboden, at the furthest tip of the circuit, just before you cross under the train tracks, there's an alternate route that winds further up the hillside. But where does it go? Well, if you head back to Riffelsee, at the final corner you can discover another road branching off. As they both go in the same direction, I'm almost positive that they're connected, thus forming a sort of extended link road between the 2 layouts. By filling in these extra unused roads onto our map, we can now see the true extent of the Matterhorn location. Bear in mind that some of this is guesswork, given that we can't actually see these missing roads in full, but I still think this paints a pretty incredible picture. Now, I've been playing GT6 since it released in 2013, and I only really noticed these unused roads as recently as last year. It really is a strange one. The actual track textures are virtually indistinguishable to the parts you can drive on. There are even fully modelled curbs. Were these intended for alternate layouts we never saw, or maybe something else? These Matterhorn tracks are some of my favourite original circuits to ever appear in the series, and whilst I think it would be fun to race on the many different layouts that could be created using these roads, I also think that this would have made Matterhorn an incredible free roam map. I mean, could you imagine this as one massive automotive playground that you could just explore freely? Or even better, a massive automotive playground that you can explore freely with 15 other players online. Now that would have been something special. Whether that was Polyphony's plan though, we'll likely never know, but the fact remains that Matterhorn could have been so much more than what we actually got. So there we are, a whole host of alternate circuit variants that have been right under our noses this entire time. No need to dive into the game files or search out obscure Easter eggs. Again, if you think you found something like this for any of the other tracks in Gran Turismo, feel free to leave it in the comments. For now, I hope you've all enjoyed this video, and it maybe even inspires you to take a closer look at some of your favourite circuits. Have a good one.